All right. So now, can you give us a breakdown on from our dispersion from 70 AD, all the way until now, 2023. 70 CE all the way until 2023 CE, where we at right now.
Sure. When we look at the time, I don't want to say continuum because that's linear time, but when you look at the time cycles, we could pick any point in this time cycle and say it was a beginning. So our movement, our presence here, again, didn't begin with Ben-Ami's vision in 1966. We could start at any point and go back to start things, leaving the west coast of Africa. But no, we're going to come back all the way to the year 70, like you said, in the present. And it goes back even farther, because it was 70 was the culmination of the judgment that led to our dispersion. It's just one aspect of that chastisement. So in the year 70, at the hands of the Romans, we begin to flee this land. We were refugees. We became vagabonds. We couldn't carry with us artifacts, because artifacts in that era were stone. We had to carry babies. We had to carry provisions and changes of clothing. We had to help elders. And so being refugees, you've seen refugees as they move around from one nation to another in trouble. They actually take as many belongings as they can, go as far as they can. They get across a border. They find refuge in a neighboring country, and they settle down for a while. And generally what happens is that they become a burden on those people. And they're like, hey, you got to go back where you came from, or you keep moving. And in the case of the Israelites, is it Leviticus 26? It speaks of I will draw a sword, I will scatter you, and I will draw a sword after you. And so the option of our returning back to this land was not there for us at that dispensation of time. Again, we had a date with destiny to meet those ships in West Africa. And so the Israelites were obliged to keep moving. Now, we weren't in any one organized group. There were some that went across the northern tier of the African continent and then down into West Africa. There were those that went down both banks of the Red Sea, where Yemen is today. There were those who went up the Nile River, and stopped at different points, 50 years here, 100 years here, 70 years here. And how do we know that? Again, documented by books like The Sign and the Seal, documentaries like The Sign and the Seal, tracing the movement of the Ark of the Covenant. So this is all part of that migration. We who ended up in the Western Hemisphere obviously were those who settled primarily in the West African regions, because that was from where the bulk of those who were carried into the Western Hemisphere were drawn. And so arriving in West Africa, pretty much at about the same time that the established trading routes and stops along the way of West Africa were shifting from ivory and gold to humans, to slaves, then when that cargo, when that trade changed, when that commodity changed, who would those traders sell? Now, Afrocentric scholars have this position that Africans were not involved in the slave trade. That, to me, is absolutely absurd. What that does is it then grants Europeans the power to say that they had come into the interior of Africa and imposed themselves on us and were able to bring us out by the millions. I'm not willing to concede that kind of power
Yeah.
to some European wimps. No, I mean, at any given time there were a couple of or half a dozen ships in the harbor. How many rowboats came to shore? How many of them could possibly have come into the interior to carry us out by the millions?
Mm-hmm.
Our narrative, what we're saying happened, is that as we began to arrive in those areas, there were already people there. There were indigenous West African peoples. And when we came into those areas as refugees, eating up their corn and their yams and their greens and trying to marry their daughters, that led to friction and problems.
Mm-hmm.
So when the slave trade evolved, and again the need for human cargo, then it was a simple matter. Hey, let's get them. They're pesky. They're encroaching on our area. They're troublesome, bringing these new ideas and different traditions and so forth. Let's sell them. Now, granted, they had no idea what awaited us in the Western Hemisphere. They were already practicing a form of what in the West has been called slavery. But it bore no resemblance to the chattel slavery that we had to endure in the Western Hemisphere. Wasn't the same thing. In what the slavery that Europeans like to attribute to African peoples prior to the great slave trade, was no more than an offense of you raped a daughter in a village, that son would have to come and work in that village for 7 years to repay his debt to society, to right that wrong. Mm-hmm. And so that was the essence of what they like to say, well, Africans were already practicing slavery. Hogwash. It wasn't like that. But nevertheless, this is a theory. And the theory, the hypothesis, if it's true that it was those Israelites that were arriving in the Western areas, if those were Israelites that were put on those ships, then let's see what is at the other end of the slave routes.
Yeah.
So in South America, you have Santeria. Mm-hmm. Santeria is Yoruba culture. Well, look at the Yoruba culture. Yoruba scholars say that many of them feel that they evolved and originated in Middle Eastern countries. This is what literally one of the scholars says, Middle Eastern countries. Again, we talk about Middle East being actually Northeast Africa. Mm-hmm. When you look at the Caribbean, well, where did Bob Marley get the idea to sing about Zion Train and Exodus, these biblical ideas? That wasn't something that he hatched. That was deeply rooted in the songs and traditions and cultures of the people that were living there. Rastafarianism, Rastafari, the 225th king in the lineage of the Union of Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. This was acknowledged. Now all of a sudden they want to make it mythic, but it was acknowledged when he was coronated. Other royalties, other royal families from Europe and Asia came to his coronation when he was coronated as Emperor Haile Selassie the First. So that thread is there, back to West Africa, back across to Ethiopia, Northeast Africa, because remember, the Promised Land is we can't think in terms of this little construct called Israel that's the size of New Jersey. The Promised Land was from the Nile to the Euphrates. Mm-hmm. Well, that's a huge swath of land that encompasses Tanzania and Uganda and Kenya and Ethiopia and Egypt and Iraq and Jordan. All that is part of the Promised Land. So that's another way to look at this. So the third stop in the Western Hemisphere was, of course, North America. And, we marked 2019, as being the 400 years. And we were so glad to see it come, because we figured no longer would they be able to say, y'all too early. Y'all done moved too soon. We thought finally we won't have to hear that no more, But we had a problem with the year 2019, because I do believe it was 1505 that the first enslaved Africans were landed at Hispaniola. where Cuba, and not Cuba, but Haiti and Dominican Republic are,
Mm-hmm.
on that island.
Mm-hmm.
1565, I believe, in St. Augustine, Florida.
Mm-hmm.
So where did this idea of Jamestown, become the beginning point?
Yeah.
But nevertheless, we know that things can be marked in seasons as not just cut and dry, and years, 365-day measurements, but we know that still in that captivity of North America, forbidden to read, write, preach, or teach, especially after Nat Turner, who was a preacher, was leading the people to Jerusalem.
Mm-hmm.
We know that they knew, they being the slave owners, they knew that we already knew something about that Bible.
Mm-hmm.
They didn't teach us the Bible. There was a Scottish explorer named Mungo Park who went into West Africa in the year 1799. He went in the area where Sierra Leone and Liberia are.
Mm-hmm.
And he meets this Mandinka brother
Mm-hmm.
whose name was Fantuma. Fantuma is a schoolmaster.
Mm-hmm.
He has in his possession the first 5 books of the Bible in Arabic, the Pentateuch.
Mm-hmm.
He has a book of Isaiah. He has a book of Psalms, all in Arabic. Why Arabic? Simply because that was the language of scholarship in West Africa at the time.
Mm-hmm.
And Hebrew and Arabic are sister languages.
Mm-hmm.
So he tells this European explorer stories about Joseph, David, Solomon, Moses. He gives out the stories as part of his own folklore, and he's surprised to find out that these white folks knew his stories. He said, how you know my stories? How you know my culture? And if that's true, and we've got Mungo Park as a record, if that's true, then our exposure to biblical texts was not via European missionaries. We already knew about the Bible. So we got to reconsider these things.
Mm-hmm.
And so in doing so, we can look and see, the only form of expression that we kept alive, that our elders and ancestors kept alive to keep that thread of cultural remembrance alive, was song. Did we sing about the river Niger, the river Volta, the river Gambia, or did we sing about the river Jordan?
Mm-hmm.
Did we sing about Mali and Songhai and Timbuktu, or did we sing about Jericho and Jerusalem and Canaan's land?
Mm-hmm.
Well, we know what we sang about. The old Negro spirituals about places in the Bible. We sang about Moses and Joshua fought the battle of Jericho.
Mm-hmm.
So this was part of our culture, and a remembrance that kept the idea of Jerusalem alive in our minds. If I forget the old Jerusalem, at my right hand forget her cunning. So that is all part of that continuum. And so fast forward, post emancipation, which of course Abraham Lincoln don't get no credit for freeing the slaves. If he put us in captivity, then he could get the credit for having freed us. But post emancipation, by the way, the root of that is there's pater in there. It's like the equivalent of a father telling his son, you run along, but make sure you back home by the time the lights come on, and you make sure you don't leave outside the gate. So that's the idea of emancipate more so than true freedom. But nevertheless, turn of the century, men, basically, primarily men, black men, were teaching and preaching that we were the lost sheep of the house of Israel. And these were itinerant preachers moving around Kansas. Prophet William S. Crowley, moving around in the Midwest. Prophet Crowley was responsible for the Church of God and Saints of Christ. I was there in 2018 for their 100th centenary of the White Plains Temple. And was happy to be able to fellowship with the brothers and sisters there, and then let them know, hey, in 2019 we're having the Ascension Summit. We're going to talk about what we're going to do post 2019. because I didn't think any of us were expecting that 2019 something was gonna fall out the sky and whisk us up, somewhere. It was something we were gonna have to do, and goes back to an earlier question. We're gonna have to come together and strategize on our escape and how we manifest that, how we invoke that, So, the year at the turn of the century, again, these preachers were teaching that. They're moving from the South to the Midwest and up to the northern industrial areas, and so it's no secret that it was in Detroit and Chicago and New York that these became the hotbeds for this idea of Hebraic identity. You ever read Charles Landing's Black Judaism, the story of an American movement? He thoroughly documented, thick volume. I recommend that everybody get it to have for your study, for your references. Because this thing goes back he goes back to the 1600s, in documenting these ideas, this Black Hebraic identity. And so, fast forward, and Ben-Ami, 66, he's part of a congregation there. First of all, he's working as a metallurgist in a foundry, and he's at the water fountain. And he meets an elder who says, "You're an Israelite. You know you're an Israelite?" And it rings a bell with what his parents had taught him. But we being teenagers and youngsters, we didn't pay too much mind to what we might have heard. It didn't mean too much. First of all, in the development of the human brain, your prefrontal lobes that deal with executive decision making and right and wrong and what have you don't even develop until you're in your mid-20s. So he hears him at the water fountain. He becomes a member of what was called a Beta Cultural Center, which was one of those Hebrew camps and congregations in the Chicago area, in the Chicago South Side. He quickly moves up in the ranks in terms of being a teacher. He masters the Hebrew language. Ben-Ami spoke Hebrew and spoke it like it was a song. He even spoke Arabic.
Wow.
And he quickly moves through the ranks, but all along he was asking, as a young man, early 20s, he was asking the elders, well, if we're Israelites, when do we return? When do we go back to the land? And the answer he was given, well, it's not time yet. We're waiting on this. We're waiting on that. I'm sure you've heard, we're waiting on the ships of Tarshish, And so that didn't rest well with him. And he in prayer and meditation, in the middle of the winter of 66, he's visited by the angel Gabriel, who instructs him in a vision that he is to begin the exodus of our people, and that it would take place in the following year, 1967. He wrestles with the idea. He doesn't want to share it because he doesn't want to be laughed at, but he says, well, the only way I'm going to find out if this was real, if I gotta share it. And in sharing it with his close circle, to his pleasant surprise, they support the idea. They said, yeah, we with you. In fact, we need to go. It's written that we would return the same way that we left. Well, we all knew we left from West Africa. So where in West Africa do we go? Another brother comes forth with some information, says, well, there's Liberia. Liberia was created for and by freed African slaves, And so they go and find out that it's written in Liberia's constitution that they are required to help any of us that want to come back. The next year, 1967, 400 men, women, and children actually were able to leave in accordance with that vision. So this is how we know that it was true. You just don't trick God and trick Yah and fake out, prophecy. You just don't stumble into your redemption. Yah has been with us every step of the way. And so in Liberia was not the objective. Liberia was simply the direction and the way station on the way back to Israel. It was our wilderness. It was that place where we had to unlearn and filter out those who, as it says, those who were, how's it written? The rebels. Not that everyone was rebellious per se, but if you join the military, if you join an elite unit like the Marines, there's a washout. You know, that ain't for everybody. When Gideon brought all his soldiers to fight against the Midianites, Creator said, no, going back home. Tell them guys they can go back and be with their wives. Next day, you know, we got all the way down to there was 300 brothers. And they, with a strategy that wouldn't make natural sense, they were able to defeat the Midianites. So now, in the same manner, we had to, you know, go through that process, the purging, and wean out those who were really the ones to be that pioneer, to have the fortitude to do what had to be done. If you're building a structure, the first people to come lay the foundation, they're going to be in the rain and the sun and the heat, whatever, they're going to be the ones out in, that's what foundation diggers do. They lay that foundation. You don't call in interior decorators at that point, you know, but that was their purpose and mission, and that's why we're so pleased and happy to give honor and credit to our pioneers. But those who stood in and weathered the idea of monsoon rainfall and malaria and dysentery, dug wells. You teach your children not to play down by the wells. Children being children, little Kanina falls in one day, and the children are afraid to come and tell us until it's too late. You know, snakes, poisonous snakes, driver ants that were raining out of the trees. You thought it was rain, but it was ants falling on the Sears and Roebuck tents that had dry rotted, the ones that were waterproof, the waterproof tents that had dry rotted. And we learned in humility, learned how the locals took thatch and laid those leaves over the tents and allowed us to get through 2.5 years there. And at the end of the 2.5 years, we felt we were ready to proceed on. But here's the end of the timeline. 1966, Ben-Ami has his vision. 67, we leave, we're in Liberia. 1968, April 3rd, back in America. J. Edgar Hoover is on record saying, prevent the rise of the black Messiah, someone who could unify and electrify the militant, strong black movement. Medgar Evers had already been shot dead. Malcolm X was already assassinated. Elijah Muhammad was deemed probably too old, but they were very, very keenly focused on Dr. Martin Luther King. Dr. King was not the same King as he was in 63 when he said, I have a dream. Dr. King in 68 had confided with his friend Harry Belafonte that sometimes I can't help but think we're integrating into a burning house. He wasn't looking inward with that dream anymore. He was beginning to look outward. And as proof of that look, that external direction shifting, not that he had made the complete turn, but he certainly had identified America as the purveyor of violence and war on the planet. Coming out against the Vietnam War as he did, he came out against the military-industrial complex. He came out against the liberals who weren't standing for principles like he thought they should have been. He was in Birmingham jail by himself, you know. But Dr. King, very frustrated man in 68. In Memphis, Tennessee, the protest that he was leading had already gone wrong one day, and he's really kind of dejected. And a message was planned for him at C.H. Mason Temple in Memphis, and he was scheduled to speak. He didn't want to go. It was a rainy night, storming. There were actual tornado warnings that particular night, and he stayed at the hotel. Ralph David Abernathy went. When Abernathy gets there, the place is packed, and they're waiting to hear King. He calls King back and says, hey, they don't want to hear me. They need to hear you. King reluctantly gets out of his bed and goes and makes his last public address. And his last few sentences publicly were, I may not get there with you, but we as a people will get to the promised land. Wait a minute. Messiah is defined in a Webster's dictionary as the anointed spiritual leader who would bring the Judean people back to the promised land. That's one of the definitions of Messiah. Hoover didn't call him Christ-like, didn't call him charismatic, didn't call him, articulate. He said Messiah, a Hebraic idea. Maybe that's why he was assassinated the next morning. He never got out of the hotel the next morning. So we were in Liberia at that time. That was April the 4th, 68. We're on transistor radios listening to the report of his assassination. We're listening to the reports of the cities in America erupt in flames. But no, there was no CNN up to the minute coverage. Mm-hmm. So we didn't hear about what he said that night. But the next month, Ben Ami and his Prince Kiskiyahu, one of his top aides, they weren't princes at that time, he was his brother Kiskiyahu, they leave Liberia and fly to Israel. Land here, stay a couple of weeks. They get back to the airport, and Ben Ami tells Kiskiyahu, I didn't get a round trip ticket for you. He said, I need you to stay here and spy out the land, immerse yourself in the culture, get the lay of the land, meet people, and be ready to receive the rest of our people when we come. 1969, the remainder of the groups came in 3-4 waves. And again, on arrival, housing station, Rod, Dimona, and 69, by 1970, the law of return was rewritten, and that began a 25-year war of attrition between us and the government, particularly the Ministry of Interior, those who control the definition of who can be here and who cannot, who give out the passports and the visas and what have you. And that 25 years we weathered. No work permits, no status. Brothers deported, arrested, deported. No work permits, no schooling, no health care. And I'm going to fast forward through this. It was an ordeal. I arrived during part of that, and I was arrested. I was deported. We lived extremely close, very crowded conditions. We had measles ran through the camp. Measles was very contagious, and the children, we had some deaths attributed to the measles. And so it was a very difficult time. But we look back and we know that is what allowed us to master that knowledge of redemption. Because we would not have had preventive health as our health system today. We would not have had a system of divine dedication versus education, where we teach our children certain principles, and we don't want them to go through and matriculate just to pursue a career. No, we want you to graduate to the service of your people and the service of the Creator. And so we look back and we remember that when Joseph was again sold into captivity by his brethren, it goes on and it's clear that Joseph was able to redeem his brethren later. And at the bottom of it, we find that